Welcome to the Pensions Basics Legislative Seminar, or Pensions 101 for short. Happy Friday and happy Valentine's Day. I'm Amy Cardona, the Executive Director of the Texas Pension Review Board. Also presenting today is David Fee, the PRB Senior Actuary. Say hi, David. Just wave.
Hi, everybody.
Okay. And then we also have Ashley Rendon, our Deputy Director. And each of us will be presenting different sections of the materials today. We do have a couple of other PRB staff on the call who are helping. Mariah Miller is helping with monitoring the chat, because if you have questions during the presentation, we'd like you to put them in the chat, and then she can notify us that we have a question. And we'll take questions as we go. We're not going to wait until the end to do that. So we'll be presenting today on the basics of public pensions with a specific focus on public pensions in Texas, since obviously that's our focus. Pensions are one of those rather complex public finance topics, so we conduct this seminar at the beginning of each legislative session to help legislative staff, governor's office staff, others, to get a handle on the basics, whether it's your first exposure to this topic or whether you're just looking for a refresher. After this seminar, we will make the recording available on our legislative session page on our website. On that page, you can also find things like our pension bill tracking reports and things like that. And of course, if any of you or your bosses would like more tailored or in-depth information or training or anything, just contact us and we're happy to provide whatever you need. Of course, if your boss happened to be assigned to the House Pensions, Investments, and Financial Services Committee yesterday, then we'll be proactively reaching out to you as well. And of course, like I said, if you have questions as we go, please type them in the chat. We'll answer questions as we go rather than waiting until the end. And so let's dive in. Next slide. Okay, a summary of what we'll cover today is on this agenda slide. So we'll provide an overview of the Pension Review Board, who we are and what we do. And then we'll discuss the landscape of Texas pension plans, kind of taking that macro level overview of public pensions in the state, how many there are, how much money are we talking about, what are the different categories and types of pension plans out there. And then we'll also talk about the legal framework in basic terms, including provisions from the Texas Constitution and an overview of a lot of the statutes that govern public pensions. And then I will hand it over to David at that point, and he will go over the current financial and actuarial condition of Texas public retirement systems. We have a lot of great charts and graphs in that section of the presentation. We'll also go over, after that section, Ashley will then take over. She'll get the baton, and she'll talk about the actuarial impact statement process. Since this is a unique role that the PRB plays every legislative session, the LBB actually issues the impact statements, but we prepare them. And so that is essentially an actuarial second opinion on the impact of pensions legislation. We'll also do an overview of the reporting requirements that Texas retirement systems have to comply with. And that'll be a pretty brief overview, but it's basically, the point is that there are a lot of different reports we receive, and that's where we get all the data that we use to do our analysis and conduct oversight activities. And then we'll also conclude by talking about some recent major projects that we completed during the last biennium. And we do have a slide at the end of this presentation that has links to several of our work products and different pages, like our data center, where we have some comparative data as well as a page for each retirement system in Texas. And we'll also put this presentation on our website after today, so you can access those links at a later time. Next slide. Okay, so just for an overview of the PRB, so we are a small agency with an important public finance oversight mission. There's an important distinction. So we oversee Texas pension systems, but we don't regulate them. The state actually does not provide any state funds for local pensions, and the vast majority of the systems that we oversee are actually local systems and not the big statewide systems that you're probably familiar with already. So I think the agency was created by the legislature in 1979 to ensure transparency and oversight, but but without enforcement tools per se. So we're actually able to achieve quite a bit with the tools we do have, which include transparency, analysis, providing technical assistance, working collaboratively with systems and their sponsors, that sort of thing. But that's just an important distinction that I wanted to lay out there. So our statutory duties are to, number one, conduct a continuing review of all Texas public retirement systems. We do a lot of that through data collection from those required reports that I mentioned. And then we conduct analysis. We produce our own reports that show kind of our assessment of the state of things. We present that at board meetings. We have data available on our website, those kinds of things. And of course, we also provide that information to the legislature as well. We conduct intensive studies of potential or existing problems that threaten the actuarial soundness of public retirement systems. So for example, we've implemented this statutory charge by doing intensive reviews of individual systems that show signs of distress. And so we have metrics, we have a process that we use to show which systems are rising to the top in terms of showing signs of issues. Some recent examples include Midland Fire that we conducted in 2021. They actually just reached a deal with the city of Midland to finally fix their funding issues, which was a process that started with our intensive review, and it took some time, but they are almost there. And then Abilene Fire is another example. That's the most recent review, intensive review that we did of an individual system. This past year, we actually did something a little bit different. We did a study of kind of several systems, kind of looking at a specific issue. So we're kind of trying to do different things with that process so we can make a bigger impact. We also do impact statements for pensions bills, like I mentioned, and Ashley will talk more about those and what process is involved later on in the presentation. We also provide information and technical assistance. One way we do that is by assisting legislative offices, by providing data or even assistance with legislative proposals when we're asked to do that. We also provide just day-to-day, our technical assistance is mostly provided to retirement systems themselves. And occasionally there's sponsors. And by sponsors, I'm talking about the employer. So typically that's going to be a city. We also recommend policies, practices, and legislation to systems and the governmental entities that sponsor them. We also make recommendations to the legislature. In the last several sessions, we've had numerous recommendations. The legislature has passed quite a few of those. This time around, we do have some statutory recommendations on the governance of our local firefighter plans that operate under a common statute known as the Texas Firefighters Retirement Act. Local Firefighters Retirement Act. I got it. It's a lot of words. And we also have some proposed statutory adjustments to one of our investments-related reporting requirements, known as the Investment Practices and Performance Evaluation requirement. And those are included in our biennial report that we published in November of 2024. And then lastly, we also develop and administer a pensions education program that provides the basics of public pensions to retirement system trustees and administrators. And because they have a training requirement that they have to meet, the legislature put in place a training requirement in 2013 in statute, and we have implemented that and we oversee compliance with that. We also provide a lot of the training ourselves. However, anyone can take our courses. So any member of the public can actually create an account on our website because we have an education page with our learning management system. So anyone can actually create an account and take those courses. And we've actually found it to be a good tool when we have new staff come on board as part of their orientation. Next slide, please. Okay, so we as staff report to our 7-member board, all appointed by the governor to 6-year staggered terms. All members fill specific slots meant to ensure diverse perspectives and expertise are represented on the board so that the board is able to conduct effective oversight. So one example of that would be that our board is required to have a member that's an actuary. And on the staff level, we have 13 authorized FTEs. We currently have 12 staff. We have technical experts, sort of our in-house consultants, and those would be David Fee, as I introduced earlier. We also have Robert Munter, who's our investment analyst. And our budget for this biennium was a little bit over $2.5 million. Next slide, please. So moving on from an overview of the agency, next I'm going to paint the big picture as far as what public pensions look like in Texas by the numbers, asset size, types of systems, because we have four main categories, the number of plans, those kinds of things, and also the basic terminology that we use when talking about pensions and retirement plans generally, as well as the governance and relevant statutes and constitutional provisions. Okay, so let's talk about some basic terminology before we do anything else. So it's really important to understand kind of these high-level concepts before we talk about the rest of the material, so it'll make more sense. So first, and actually in David's section of the presentation, he'll be going over some of the actuarial terms as well. So first, the pensions financing equation. Basically, you want contributions plus investment income to equal benefits plus expenses. When I talk about expenses, I'm talking about like the cost to have staff for retirement system, their investment expenses, the expenses for contracting with an actuary, for example. There are three basic types of retirement plans where that equation applies in different ways. So the first is the defined benefit plan. Most public pensions are defined benefit plans, and that's where you guarantee a certain benefit, a lifetime benefit to employees who retire from the system. And then the retirement system uses actuarial methods to calculate how much that benefit will cost, and then how much the plan's expenses will be, and what will be the contributions and investment income. And so the goal is for that equation to balance. And really, in this case, the risk is on the employer to make sure that they're not over-promising benefits and not, they have to make sure they're adequately funding the benefits promised. And then so essentially with the defined benefit plan, you're starting from with the benefit and then working backwards to determine what the financing arrangement needs to be in order to fully fund those promised benefits. With a defined contribution plan, those are essentially 401ks, 403bs, et cetera. In this case, the contributions themselves are defined with the benefit not guaranteed. So these are obviously more common in the private sector, but a lot of state and local governmental entities offer supplemental defined contribution plans to employees. The employees' retirement system is an example of that. They have an optional defined contribution plan that employees can use. And in the case of DC plans, the risk is borne by the individual employee. And then you also have hybrid plans, which combine aspects of the defined contribution and defined benefit plans. It's still a guaranteed lifetime benefit for the employee, but there's more risk sharing between the employer and the employee. And then based on reforms passed by the legislature in 2021, ERS implemented a new hybrid, or sometimes called cash balance tier, for employees starting on or after September 1st of 2022. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about some numbers. So this is our bubble chart. That's what I call it anyway. In Texas, we have 351 public retirement systems. Of those, 100 are defined benefit plans, which are the main focus of the PRB's oversight activities. Oversight and reporting for defined benefit plans is much more robust than it is for the DC plans. The reason is that with the DB plans, the financial risk falls on the employer, which in this case, we're talking about public systems, so we're talking about risk to state or local governmental entities. In terms of assets, as of January 2025, we have collectively the 100 retirement systems in the state have $381 billion in total assets. The bubble chart shows the relative asset size of the different types of DB systems in Texas. By far, the largest are the 7 statewide systems. The two main ones that you're going to know more about or hear more about are the employees' retirement system and the teacher retirement system. And actually, the vast majority of that $332 billion in statewide assets is held by TRS. A distant second in terms of total assets are the 17 municipal plans. And municipal plans, we're typically talking about pension plans for employees in the larger metro areas in Texas. So City of Austin has 3. They have Austin Police, Austin Fire, and then City of Austin Employees Retirement System. So that's essentially for non-public safety employees. Then we have, and Houston has the same. So they have 3 different systems. San Antonio has a fire and police system. They also have one for their municipal employees that don't work in police or fire. And then in Dallas, they have Dallas Police and Fire, and then the Dallas Employees Retirement Fund, which is sort of non-public safety employees. And then in third place, in terms of assets, collective assets are the special district plans. So we're talking about entities like hospital districts, transit authorities, appraisal districts, those sorts of entities. And those are, I can't actually, oh, there we go, 9.2 billion, yeah. And then lastly, we have TELFRA systems. So those are the Texas Local Firefighters Retirement Act systems. There's 42 of those. So that's 42 out of the 100 systems that we oversee. But as you can see, the total assets held by those systems is quite small. So they are numerous, but they tend to be quite small. And that can also be confusing because like I mentioned before, the large metro areas have separate municipal systems that cover their police and fire. So the local firefighter systems, you typically see those in kind of the small to mid-sized Texas cities. The largest TELFRA plans in Texas are around $250 million in assets, which is relatively, I mean, it seems like a lot, but it's actually relatively small compared to other systems. And those are Irving Fire, Amarillo Fire, and Lubbock Fire. And then the smallest ones that we see are systems like San Benito Fire and Atlanta Fire, where you're talking about just a few million in assets and really just like a dozen or 2 dozen members. And then if you compare those with the largest municipal system in Texas, which is Houston Police, they have almost 8 billion in assets. So there's just a huge variety in terms of the size of different systems. Okay, next slide. Okay, just a little bit more information on Texas Plan. So 2 of the statewide systems that have what we call cash balance or hybrid plans are the Texas Municipal Retirement System and the Texas County and District Retirement System. These systems are statewide, but they serve a lot of cities, particularly the smaller cities. And then TCDRS serves the counties and districts that don't have their own retirement plans. So you're talking about hundreds of municipalities and counties and districts that are served by those 2. And then I did mention before that ERS now has a 4th group or 4th tier, which is anyone starting on or after September 1st of 2022 is now in tier 4, which is the cash balance tier, or the kind of the hybrid option. And also just to reiterate, a lot of governmental entities in the state also offer defined contribution plans in addition to the defined benefit plans they offer. Okay, next slide. We went over this a little bit already, but I just wanted to talk about numbers again. So we have 7 statewide systems, and then we've got 17 major municipal systems. 14 of those are governed by state statute. We have 42 TELFRA systems, so again, numerous but small on average. And then we have 34 local systems offered by other types of political subdivisions like appraisal districts or water districts. And we call these 810 plans because they all operate under Chapter 810 of the Government Code. Okay, next slide. Okay, so on this slide, there are some, basically it's kind of a summary of some of the provisions of the Texas Constitution that apply to public pensions. One is just the general constitutional authority to create public pensions in the first place. There's also a provision that's really important that comes into play during the legislative session because the Constitution sets a contribution floor and a contribution ceiling for the teachers' retirement system and the employees' retirement system. So that's 6% and 10%, respectively. Lastly, the Constitution provides a provision that protects benefits already accrued. So if an employee has already earned a benefit, they have to receive that benefit. Benefit reductions can be prospective, meaning that maybe you change the benefit structure and any future accruals for that same employee would be under the new structure, but they would still have to be provided the benefits that they had under the old system as well. So benefit reductions that are prospective, they can be reduced and not violate the Constitution. And this has been litigated multiple times over the years. A couple of examples are litigation related to Dallas Police and Fire, as well as Fort Worth employees retirement system. Next slide. Okay, so this slide and the next cover the governance of public pension systems. One of the main takeaways of this is that sort of the governance structures and when I talk about governance, I'm really talking about the decision-making process and what's involved in that, who makes the decisions and how they're made. That is kind of all over the map. It's different for different systems. And so just to kind of go into this a little bit, TRS and ERS, for example, cannot make changes to their contributions or benefits without going through the legislature. So the legislature has to pass legislation to do that, or they have to dedicate funds through the appropriations process as well, depending on specifically what the change is. Many of these 17 municipal systems that we talked about that serve employees in some of the larger metro areas, they have to come to the legislature to request changes to their benefit and contribution arrangement. So one example of a system like that would be San Antonio Fire and Police. Other municipal systems are allowed to make certain contribution or benefit changes without legislative approval. Those would include systems like Fort Worth employees, and then the Telfra systems, the local firefighter systems. Their law includes a minimum contribution, basically a contribution floor. So the cities have to contribute a minimum of, I think, 12%, if I'm remembering correctly. But most of the specific benefit and contribution decisions are made locally. And then we also have the 810 plans, like I mentioned, those special district plans. They have total authority to determine their plan provisions locally. They just have to follow the general provisions in Chapter 810 of the Government Code. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm not going to go over all of this specifically, but this last slide is really just, so it is the last slide before I hand it over to David for the next section. On this slide, you'll see different statutes that govern the 100 defined benefit plans in Texas, starting with the statewide systems at the top. And then, and you'll notice that most of those they're all in the Government Code in different chapters. And then for the local systems, those are in Vernon civil statutes for the most part. And the statutes are population bracketed if it's for an individual system. So it's not going to be obvious always which statute you're looking at if you see a related bill. So for example, we just saw a bill filed, I think yesterday, that applies to Austin Fire. We also saw a bill filed that relates to Houston Fire. But if you're looking at the bill and you see a population bracket, then you may not immediately know what it's referring to. So this is really just to help you reference the sections in Vernon's and the population brackets that they refer to when you're looking at bills. Okay, so any questions before we move on to the next section? I wanted to pause and see if there's any in the chat. Anything, Mariah?
Sorry, I'm muted. No, there is not.
Okay. All right, so the next section is on the actuarial and financial status of retirement systems. David, our senior actuary, is going to present that section. And he is a big Houston Astros fan, so don't be surprised if he makes Astros references during his remarks. So take it away, David.
Good. I'm David Fee, the actuary, and let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So there's two key measures the PRB uses to assess a system's financial condition. One is the funded ratio, which is just the assets as a percentage of the liability. And one is the funding period, which is how long it will take to pay off the liability. So the funded ratio is a snapshot of what kind of place the system is in now. The funding period is an estimate of how fast they will get to a better place. Then the most important economic assumption used to calculate these key measures is the expected investment return. So a 1% change in the expected return may change the liability by as much as 15%. So, if you need to pay $1 million a year from now and you think you can earn 10% on your money, then you need a lot less today than you would if you only expect to earn 5% on your money. So a higher expected return then results in a lower liability, and an artificially high return expectation would result in an artificially lower liability. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So there's two main terms we'll hear when discussing pension obligations. One is the liability and one is the normal cost. In this pie chart, the whole pie is referred to as the present value future benefits. And so this member has worked 25 years. And so the present value future benefits represents the 25 years the member will work from the time he hires to the time he retires. But he's only worked 10 years so far. So the Astros blue piece of the pie represents 10 years. That's the liability. Then the remaining 15 years will be recognized 1 year at a time as normal costs, and that's in the Astros orange piece of the pie. So right now, the liability represents the cost of 10 years that the workers already worked. And then the normal cost represents the cost of the 11th year that's about to be worked. So if the system is underfunded, then funding needs to cover the normal cost to stay on track to pay for the 11th year, but also pay for a portion of the 10 years that have not yet been paid for. We can go on to the next slide. So we have pension funding guidelines. The PRB provides guidance to public retirement systems and their sponsoring government entities in meeting their long-term pension obligations. And the guidelines are meant to foster communication between the systems and their sponsors as they determine a reasonable approach to responsible funding. So some key ones on this slide are guidelines 4, 5, and 6. Combined, they say a system should be at a 30-year funding period or less by 2025, and then they should reach 15 years by 2040. And then they should stay under those 15 years in all future years, even when they're trying to increase benefits. So why do we pick a 15-year funding period? Well, at 30 years, you're really making little to no progress paying down your unfunded liability. But when you start to get below 20 years or so, that's when you really start paying down the unfunded liability. And also, we want benefits to be accrued and paid at the same time. So chances are members aren't planning to work more than 15 years on average. So by paying off liabilities within 15 years, we can assure that any benefit increases that are enjoyed by current members are going to be paid for by those same current members and current taxpayers, not future members and future taxpayers. Move on to the next one. So this slide shows the funding progress at PRB board meeting dates over the last 2 years. So we talked about how important the expected return rate or discount rate, as it's shown here, can be. So beneath each bar, you can see the average rate was 7.01% in our December 2022 meeting, and it's decreased steadily to 6.94% by December of 24. Then the lines show average funded ratio in two ways. So that top line reflects TRS and ERS actual weighting, where they make up 2/3 of the assets and liabilities. And on that basis, Texas systems on average are around 79% funded. Then the bottom line reflects TRS and ERS as if they are just 1/100th of the average, just like any other system. And on that basis, Texas systems are on average around 74% funded. Then if we look at the bars, remember that our pension funding guidelines call for systems to be at a 30-year funding period now, and then a 15-year funding period by 2040. So we already have well over 30 systems meeting the 2040 guideline. And then since 2022, the systems above that 30-year threshold shown in yellow has declined from almost 30 in the leftmost bar to just over 20 systems 2 years later. And with several systems subject to funding soundness restoration plans, which Ashley will discuss later, we could easily have 10 systems or less above that threshold by the end of this year. Go on to the next one. So here we're looking at system overview by type, split between statewide, TELFRA, municipal, and 810. In the top left box, you can see that it's largely our local firefighter municipal systems that have higher funding periods and lower funded ratios. Comparing the two, municipal systems have much higher funded ratios, meaning they're in a better starting place, but they have very similar funding periods. One's 27 and one's 23. And so that means that while fire systems may be starting from behind, they're expected to improve at a faster pace. In the top right box, you can see that local firefighter systems tend to be our most optimistic when setting assumptions. followed closely by municipal systems. So whereas most statewide systems are at that 7% expected return, most Telfer systems are above 7%, and roughly 10% of both Telfer and municipal each expect to earn more than 7.5% net of expenses. And so gross returns would have to be over 8% in general to hit that 7.5% net of expenses. Then in the lower left box, when it comes to funding periods, almost 40% of Telfer systems and over 20% of municipal systems have funded periods above the 30-year threshold, while over half of statewide and 810 systems have already reached our 2040 goal of 15 years or less. Then when it comes to funded ratios in the lower right box, a little more than half of Telfer systems and almost 40% of municipal systems are below the 65% threshold that Ashley will discuss later when we discuss funding soundness restoration plans. Move on to the next one. So in the last box, we were looking at how things are today. This slide looks at how things have improved over the last 6 years. So in the top left box, we would hope to see average expected returns decreasing, which we did, pretty similarly across the board. We would expect the average funding period to decrease by 6 years. The local firefighter plans actually came really close to that at 4.9, much closer than municipal plans, which were only 1.3. Then average funded ratio, we would hope to see an increase, which we did for all types except our large municipal systems. In the top right box, you can see 40% of Telfer systems lowered their expected returns by 50 basis points or more. In the lower left box, you can see about 2/3 of Telfer municipal systems showed funding period improvement. And then in the lower right box, you can see more than half of Telfer municipal systems decreased their funded ratios. So that's obviously not the direction we want, but this is going to continue until they get to funding periods below 20 years or so. So we can move on to the next one. So we've talked about the assumption for expected investment returns, and now we're looking at how actual returns have compared to the expectation. So if we focus on the 10-year returns in orange compared to the assumption that's in blue, 810 plans have come somewhat close but missed by 40 basis points. Municipal plans have similar returns to 810 plans but much higher assumptions, so they missed by 100 basis points. Statewide systems actually beat their estimates. And then local firefighter systems had the highest expectations and the lowest reality. So they missed by almost 200 basis points. And we can go to the last slide. So we want systems to generate their returns using a mix of asset classes. So in response to a market event, real estate, equities, fixed income, they may all move in different directions to varying degrees. And that results in a more stable set of investments overall than if, say, a portfolio was comprised of all US stocks only. So you don't need to worry too much about the change in mutual funds. So we've improved the information we received over the last 10 years. So whereas we used to just be told, hey, we're invested this much in mutual funds, now we know whether it's an equity mutual fund, a bond mutual fund, et cetera, so we can better allocate it into the other categories. The main trend we've seen is an increased focus on private equity. That's represented here in the alternatives category. Now, private equity is tricky because we don't know the true value of the equity until it gets purchased or listed on an exchange. Until then, its value is estimated by an auditor. Now, some investment consultants will say private equity lowers volatility, but you have to wonder if that supposed lower volatility is due to the same auditor deciding the value year after year after year, rather than the market determining the value. And there have been cases where one system owns the same private equity in two separate funds, and the equity gets valued differently in those two places within the same portfolio because it's valued by two separate auditors. Now, we're not saying this doesn't have a place in the portfolio. It can be very valuable. It just does come with some issues. So if there's no questions on my section, I will hand it over to Ashley.
Yeah, there's no questions on this either. You did a good job covering it, David.
All right. Thanks, David. Okay, so we're on to the actual impact statement process. The PRB provides actual impact statements to analyze the economic or financial impact of a proposed pension bill on a public retirement system. It works kind of like a fiscal note. However, since pension systems create a financial commitment far into the future, an impact statement assesses how the changes in the bill will impact the long-term funding of the retirement system. The PRB monitors all pension bills that are filed during a legislative session. So last session, there were 136 pension bills, and we provided 66 actuarial impact statements. We also publish a pension bill tracking report that can be found on our website. And also, if you're interested, we also email them out. And so if you would like to be part of that, please let us know and we can add you. So what are some key components of an actuarial impact statement? We have some listed here on the slide. Generally includes a summary of changes in benefit formula and provisions. You'll usually find this in the bill synopsis section of an impact statement. We'll include the assets and liabilities of the system and any resulting changes to the funded ratio and unfunded liability. This might be in the very first section, which is called actuarial effects in our impact statements, and also or in findings and conclusions section. That might also include a discussion on the normal cost percentage and employee or employer contributions. And then also for funding period, we usually will reference the PRB's pension funding guidelines that David went over earlier, or if it's a local system, the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan statute, since they both establish thresholds for measuring actuarial soundness in Texas. We'll reference the actuarial assumptions and the valuation that it comes from. That's usually under methodology and standards. And then also we do provide a glossary at the end with some terms that you may need. So how do we know if a bill needs an actuarial impact statement? It's pretty simple. Any bill that may affect elements of the basic funding equation that Amy went over earlier, that will likely trigger an impact statement. And so we have some examples here under each kind of element. And so, for example, a change to or an addition of a cost of living adjustment or a supplemental payment that would, require an impact statement. So how does it work? Thank you for asking. When a bill with a potential cost effect on a public retirement system is scheduled for a hearing, we obtain an actuarial analysis of the bill from the affected system's actuary. And so once we receive that analysis, our actuary, Mr. Fee, will review and provide a second opinion on that analysis. So we have the actuarial analysis, we have the actuarial review, and then along with a bill synopsis, we will put all those together into an actuarial impact statement. We submit that impact statement to the Legislative Budget Board, who reviews and issues the final impact statement. That is then attached to the bill and follows it along the process. If there are any changes made to the bill that would require a new analysis, that starts the process over again. And so we'll get a new analysis, we'll have a new review of that analysis and a new impact statement. During session, we also are required to prepare what is called a cumulative effect report, and that's just for ERS and TRS bills. So at 70 days before the end of session, that would be covering all bills that have been heard in a committee. And then at 30 days before the end of session, that would cover all bills that have passed at least one house. So kind of what happens if the bills that are still in play all pass. All right, so we are at reporting requirements and recent PRB projects. So systems in Texas are required to submit several reports to us fairly regularly. This slide breaks them down by frequency and who is impacted. The main takeaway here is that the data from these reports provides the foundation for everything we do. The data, we input that into our database, it feeds into our data center, and all of the reports that we provide to the board, the legislature, the public, any analysis or reports that we provide, it is based on the data that we receive in these reports. So for example, every 3 years, at least once every 3 years, all systems are required to provide an actuarial evaluation. Most systems do these annually, and we use that data to provide one of the main kind of reports that we have is an actuarial evaluation report that we provide to our board kind of quarterly whenever they meet. And you can find that on our website under Actuarial. And it provides some of that information that David just went over and so much more. So if you're interested in more Astros, orange and blue, you can check those out. And then there are some on here that have asset thresholds, so they're only applicable to those systems. And then another group for kind of living documents that anytime it changes, those are sent to us as well. And then, so on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan. And so Funding Soundness Restoration Plan, or FSRP, has been a requirement going on about a decade now, and it is required to be developed jointly by a system and its sponsor. So again, like Amy said, local plan, it's usually the sponsor is going to be the city. And basically, you can think of it as a remediation plan. They're required to put this together with and agree to it with the city or sponsor if the system receives a few actuarial evaluations that show their funding period that is over a stated threshold. So in 2021, that threshold changed from 40-year amortization period to 30. And so over a few valuations, if the funding period is above 30 years, that will trigger the requirement. Coming in September of this year, September 1st, there will be some additional immediate triggers. So it would take one valuation rather than 2 or 3. So any system with an actuarial evaluation showing 40 years, that triggers an immediate FSRP, or if they receive a valuation that has an amortization period over 30 years, and then also a funded ratio, so the assets to liabilities below 65%, then that would also trigger an immediate, the requirement immediately. And so there are a few other changes that happened in 2021, but the bottom line is here, you know, we're actively monitoring this this requirement, and you know, David also provides an FSRP report during our board meetings, and so that is also on our website, and we maintain a list of systems at various steps, whether they received 1 or 2 valuations with the funding periods as well. So for investment practices and performance evaluations, or IPPEs, again, these are the ones that are required by systems who meet a certain asset threshold. Systems that are required to conduct this evaluation must hire an independent firm to evaluate their investment practices and performance, and then make recommendations for improvement. And so our role here is to review and summarize these evaluations and put together what's called an investment performance report, and then include it into our biennial report to the legislature. Okay, moving on to our activities, and I'll give you a high-level overview here. So we've had 2 major IT projects, one to rebuild our internal database. Again, all the data from these reports that we just went over are put into that database, and all of our analysis comes from that. So this was a critical project for us. We completed that at the end of 2023. And the second project was to build a portal for systems to use to upload all of their reports to us. That we completed this summer in August. And so that is, we're providing some technical assistance ongoing for that, but it is, really streamlining our workflow and our processes. And so that has been a really good project for us as well. Let's see. And when we updated the pension funding guidelines, we also updated the funding policy guidance, which is to help systems and their sponsors develop a funding policy. And our goal for these was to make sure they reflected current statute and best practices. Amy gave you some information on the intensive studies that we went into, and I'll give a little bit more information on the funding soundness restoration plan one here in a bit. And so we kind of did some heavy lifting here on the investment side of pensions. Over the last several sessions, the reporting on investments has increased, reporting requirements. And so we are now at the point where we're able to pull a good data set to take a more comprehensive look at investments, and similar to how we provide the actuarial evaluation reports. And so kind of our next step there is to work to get this data onto our data center. But for now, we do have an investment data report that we have on our website. We also overhauled our education rules for the minimum educational training program that we administer, setting general program requirements, education requirements for system administrators and trustees, and requirements for training providers that we accredit under the program. So we made some much needed changes to improve efficiency and system compliance here. So for the FSRP study, as Amy mentioned earlier, we did this in lieu of an intensive review of a single system, and instead we looked at several systems that have or will become subject to the requirement. And we provided some case studies of local firefighter systems and the steps that they took since the 2021 changes to reach the 30-year funding period. And so this is linked on this presentation and also on our website. And then also concerning local firefighter systems, we underwent a year-long study focused on local firefighter retirement system governance. We involved stakeholders and had several discussions to identify some issue areas and then propose recommendations to our board. In September of 2024, our board adopted 18 of our recommendations, 11 of which would require statutory changes. And all of this information is also in our biennial report and on our website. And here is just some additional information on intensive reviews. All of these, the full reports are on our website as well, but this just gives you an idea of the intensive reviews that we did on specific systems. And we have reached this resource page that I think I referenced quite a few times, but it has a lot of things that we discuss, and just really we try to make as much information as we can available on our website. And so I hope you're able to take a look around. And also our data center provides individual system, comparative, and aggregate data, which you might find useful. And like Amy mentioned, the PRB online courses are free. Anybody can sign up for them. And we have 12 of them right now on there. See if we have any questions. We're happy to answer.
Still no questions in the chat, at least.
I mean, at this point, y'all can just unmute yourselves and ask a question if you want to.
We do have one question in the chat right now. Actually, a couple are coming in. So first one is, how is TRS going to be affected by SB2?
So we prepared an impact statement for the introduced version of that bill. I know it was amended several times on the Senate side, but I don't know. I don't think that any of those amendments had an impact on the actuarial analysis. And David can add to this as well, but essentially the analysis that we got from TRS is essentially, when they do their calculations and, their projections and everything, they assume that teacher headcount is going to stay level. It's a pretty conservative assumption, even though in reality, it has gone up over time. And so they did provide some scenarios that, if you saw like I think a 1% reduction in headcount, what that would look like for the actuarial status of the fund. But I think just in summary, I don't believe that their actuary thinks that SP2 would have a significant impact on the fund's actuarial soundness. Did I miss anything there, David?
No, I think that's accurate. Basically, the only scenario where, it would cause a huge problem would be if, for TRS, would be if in conjunction with that, we also had a declining population in the state of Texas, was their opinion.
I think there was a second question too. I think I saw the question was, will we make the presentation available? Yes. So we have, I think we could send it out to the folks that signed up for this, but we'll also have it. So we have a legislative page on our website at prb.texas.gov. And we have a page for the 89th session. And once we'll basically put up the presentation itself and the recording. So, anyone who wasn't able to attend today can also watch it later. But we'll make the presentation available for sure, because we include a lot of links in here, and we want you to actually be able to use them. Anybody else? I know we threw a lot of information at you, but and then of course, if any of you have questions that you think of later, just don't hesitate to reach out because we're always available. And yeah, I mean, if you need anything else or have questions about any of the reports that we talked about or anything about pensions, we're happy to help.